To that extent, I think a different sort of national urban strategy is developing within the UK and within England in particular. And certainly the direction of change which you've seen means that a new sort of national urban strategy is possible. Whether that is desirable depends on whether you want to take the position of arguing that we should be very traditional in our approach to urban areas. We should think primarily about people, and we should think primarily about the quality of life of people. Lots of the ways in which we allocate public expenditure in the UK and in European countries in general, I think, is based on a very classical welfare state model, so that the services that people receive from the public sector should be delivered wherever somebody lives and irrespective of their personal circumstances. The principle of fairness in the allocation of public resources, I think, is still very powerful in the UK. What this new approach to urban policy begins to argue is that we may adhere to the principle of fairness in terms of the allocation of public expenditure to support, for example, health services or the provision of education, to some extent to the provision of housing, particularly social housing. But we need to contextualise that with some understanding of the way in which different urban areas are likely to perform in the future, and try to find a balance between trying to encourage agglomeration economies in those areas which have the greatest prospects, whilst not forgetting the problems of those areas which have lesser prospects. That is a very big political issue, and the way in which urban policy is tending is surfacing those issues, is encouraging debate about those issues. Colleagues around the table will be able to decide whether that direction of travel is desirable. It's certainly very political, but it's only political, I would argue, in England with a small p. This is not a huge political issue on which there is a great deal of difference between the major parties. So I don't expect any great change, even though, as we all expect, we are likely to have a change of government in a year or so's time. On the third question of whether the UK experience is replicable in other national circumstances, I think you had a question which said, are conditions and structures in the UK so specific to the UK that it's very difficult to translate experience to other places? I think to some extent the UK is unusual in that it's not only a unitary state, it's also a very centralised unitary state. So all of the initiatives I've been describing in urban policy don't change the fact that we continue to be a politically very centralised country. So the sorts of initiatives which we've seen in the UK, I think primarily would apply only to those unitary states which have some similar characteristics. And there are some unitary states where, even though in principle relations between central and local governments are similar to those that we have in England, I'm thinking of the Netherlands, for example, there is much more of a sort of an open relationship, if you like, between central and local government, it seems to me, in the Netherlands than there is in the UK. I remember doing some work in the Netherlands some years ago where I was asking about the origins of particular attempts to regenerate areas of Dutch cities. And it was very difficult for people to say whether an idea came from central government, came from provincial government, it came from a national government department. It seems to me there is much more interaction in the Dutch administrative system between levels of government than there is in the UK. That having been said, I think the next questions that you asked were about what has worked successfully in the UK, and may be of interest particularly to an Italian audience, but to a European audience more generally. I think the direct and explicit urban programs that we've developed, when they have worked, when they've been effective, have been comparatively large in terms of the resources that have been devoted to them. They've tended to be very specific in the areas that they treated, as it were. So this wasn't a dedicated resource for a huge territory. It was focused on a very specific area within a particular city. It tended to be long term, so urban issues and problems are not solved within political timescales. We must talk about 5 years and more for dedicated initiatives. And the successes, I think, are based on integrated approaches where there is a degree of consensus between local authorities, between various different partners in delivering those initiatives. When you put those criteria together, there are actually very few of the urban programs that we developed in the past which passed those tests. In the 1990s, we had a program called City Challenge, for example, which I think had most of those characteristics. But, and I'm leading into your next question in providing these comments, I think mainly there is a tendency for urban programs and policies to change very quickly. So an initiative will be developed because, as you mentioned in your paper, the symbolic value of urban programs is pretty important, particularly for national politicians. So whenever a minister changes within the UK government, we have had a tendency for another urban initiative to be developed so that the government is able to present the fact that they are thinking about urban issues and problems